In the 2nd century before Christ, a scribe in Judea copied a text that was already ancient. In its pages, 7 stars are named. They are described as burning mountains bound at the edge of the world. They wander across the sky in patterns no human of that time had the instruments to measure. And one of them, punished, imprisoned, dyed the colour of dried blood, sits in a red pit that the text says is the place of the disobedient ones. 2,000 years later, on the 25th of July 1976, an American spacecraft transmitted the first close photographs of a red planet at the edge of the sky. What the mission scientists saw was the exact reason the text describing it had been removed from every Bible in Europe for 1,300 years. The text is called the Book of Enoch. Not the short reference to Enoch in Genesis, a separate document, dense with cosmology, running to over 100 chapters, attributed to the 7th generation from Adam. It exists. It is physical. 22 manuscript fragments in Aramaic were recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran between 1946 and 1956. They date to roughly 200 years before Christ, older than the earliest surviving copies of most of the Old Testament. The New Testament Epistle of Jude quotes from it directly, naming Enoch as prophesying about the Last Judgment. Tertullian defended it as scripture in the 2nd century. Irenaeus cited it. Clement of Alexandria used it. Justin Martyr assumed his readers already knew it. Then, at a regional church council held in the city of Laodicea in 364 AD, the Book of Enoch was excluded from the canon of Scripture. 3 years later, Athanasius of Alexandria issued his Festal letter, 39, which formalized a shorter list of accepted books. Enoch did not survive the cut. It was not preserved as apocryphal, not maintained as edifying reading, not stored in monastic libraries with a careful footnote. It vanished. For approximately 1,300 years, no complete copy existed anywhere in Europe. Then, in 1773, a Scottish explorer brought 3 copies back from a mountain kingdom that had never received the memo. And when biblical scholars finally read what those copies contained, most of them went quiet about the specifics. To understand why the silence matters, you have to understand what the book actually says. The Book of Enoch does not read like the rest of the Bible. It reads like a report. The prophet Enoch is taken on a guided tour of the cosmos by the archangel Uriel. He is shown the storehouses of the winds. He is shown the paths of the sun and the moon, calculated to the day. Chapters 72 through 82, called the Book of Luminaries, describe a 364-day solar calendar with precision that surprised early Assyriologists when they compared it to Babylonian tablets recovered in the 19th century. But it is not the calendar that made the book uncomfortable. It is what Enoch is shown in the middle chapters. He is taken to the ends of the earth. He sees 7 mountains. He sees a pit that burns. He sees stars that abound. In chapter 18, he describes 7 stars like great burning mountains, and the angel with him explains that these are the stars which transgressed the command of God at the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth in their appointed times. They are bound in that place for 10,000 years. Chapter 21 returns to the same scene. Enoch calls it the prison of the stars. He specifies that this is where the disobedient ones are held. The book does not stop there. It names them. It describes their leader, Shemyaza. It describes the 200 who descended on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared. It describes what they did on earth, whom they taught, and how their offspring, the Nephilim, corrupted the human line. Chapter 10 records the sentence passed on them. They are bound underneath the earth in a place of jagged stones. They will be released only for judgment. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never accepted the Laodicean exclusion. Ethiopia had received Enoch through its own translation tradition in Ge'ez, probably in the 4th or 5th century, and considered it canonical scripture. It still does. When James Bruce, a 6'4" Scotsman travelling in search of the source of the Nile, spent 7 years wandering the Ethiopian highlands between 1768 and 1773, he acquired the Ge'ez manuscripts from monasteries that had preserved them without interruption for over 1,000 years. He brought 3 copies back to Europe. One went to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation in 1821. R. H. Charles, an Oxford scholar, published the definitive translation in 1912. Charles was measured. He was a serious biblical scholar. But when he came to the passages on the wandering stars, he wrote in his commentary that the astronomical descriptions in Enoch appeared to reflect observations rather than invention. He did not go further than that. In the climate of Edwardian Oxford, he did not have to. The stated reason for excluding Enoch from the canon was that it was pseudonymous, that its authorship was uncertain, that it fell outside the Hebrew canon accepted by Jewish authorities in the same period. These are the reasons given in the standard patristic histories. They are not unreasonable reasons. Other apocryphal books were excluded for similar concerns, but the reasoning breaks down under a specific pressure. Many other pseudonymous texts were tolerated. The Book of Wisdom, attributed to Solomon centuries after his death, remained in Catholic and Orthodox canons. The additions to Daniel, the additions to Esther, Tobit, Judith, all of these are preserved. Enoch was not merely excluded, it was actively removed from circulation. Jerome, in producing the Latin Vulgate at the end of the 4th century, refused to translate Enoch. Augustine, writing in the City of God, acknowledged that Enoch had been quoted in the Epistle of Jude, but argued that this quotation did not automatically confer canonical status. His reasoning had force, but the practical effect went beyond exclusion. Copies stopped being made. Monasteries that had held the text let it decay. By the time of the Carolingian revival in the 9th century, no Western scholar had a copy to consult. The text had been argued out of existence. The question that survives every polite explanation is why Enoch specifically? Why this text and not others of comparable dubious authorship? And the answer that recurs when you read the 4th century writers carefully is that Enoch contained a cosmology that competed with the emerging orthodox one. Genesis chapter 6 alludes briefly to the sons of God taking daughters of men, producing the Nephilim. It leaves the story ambiguous. Enoch does not. Enoch names the beings, describes their descent, catalogues their crimes, and locates their prison. It provides a detailed geography of judgment. It describes celestial mechanics with precision. And most inconveniently, it treats the fallen ones not as an abstract spiritual mystery, but as a specific event with specific coordinates. The Council of Laodicea did not need to declare Enoch dangerous. It only needed to declare it uncanonical. In the intellectual economy of the late Roman Empire, that was enough. What was not read was not preserved. What was not preserved was not remembered. And by the time the manuscripts came back from Ethiopia in 1773, the descriptions they contained had been out of the Western conversation so long that Enlightenment scholars could not agree on what to make of them. Lawrence's 1821 translation caused a brief stir. Then it was shelved. Charles's 1912 edition was read by specialists. The general public forgot again. And this second forgetting held until the discovery at Qumran forced the text back into scholarly view. The Qumran discoveries between 1946 and 1956 changed the physical status of Enoch permanently. J.T. Milik, the Polish scholar who edited the Aramaic fragments for the definitive 1976 Oxford edition, identified pieces of 11 separate manuscripts of Enoch material in Cave 4 alone. These fragments proved that the text was already ancient when the Qumran community copied it, that it was considered important enough to preserve in multiple copies, and that its cosmological sections were part of the original composition, not later additions. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, working with James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, produced the standard modern critical commentary in the Hermeneia series. They read Enoch as visionary literature from the Second Temple period. They do not read it as a physical description of another planet. This is the mainstream scholarly position, and it deserves to be stated clearly. But the mainstream position does not close every question the text raises. Chapter 18, Enoch describes 7 stars specifically. 7. In every ancient astronomical system that had developed by the 2nd century BCE, the number of visible wandering stars was exactly 7. The Sun, the Moon, and the 5 planets visible without magnification. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The Babylonians, whose astronomical records Enoch's Book of Luminaries appears to draw from, catalogued the same 7. Otto Neugebauer, the mathematician and historian of ancient science at Brown University, whose 3-volume work A History of Ancient Mathematical Astronomy remains the standard reference, argued in his commentary on Enoch that the astronomical material in the Book of Luminaries reflects genuine observational tradition, not myth, observation. Of those 7 wanderers, one has been distinguished across every ancient culture by the same set of attributes. The Babylonians called it Nergal, the god of pestilence and destruction. The Greeks called it Ares, the god of war. The Romans called it Mars. Sanskrit tradition called it Mangala, the burning one. In every case, red, wrathful, associated with punishment, blood, and ruin. In every case, one wanderer singled out from the others for exactly the attributes that Enoch assigns to the leader of the disobedient stars. Bound in a red pit, punished for a violation of law, held at the edge of the sky. Then, on July 25, 1976, the Viking 1 orbiter transmitted a series of photographs of the Cydonia region on Mars. Dr. Vincent DiPietro and Dr. Gregory Molinar, both image processing engineers at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, examined the images and published their analysis in 1980. They identified features that had non-natural geometric characteristics. Dr. Mark Carlotto, an optical engineer, followed with a fractal analysis in the journal Applied Optics in 1988, concluding that at least one of the features was distinguishable from surrounding terrain by mathematical criteria alone. Higher resolution imagery from the Mars Global Surveyor in 1998 and 2001 resolved much of the Cydonia controversy in favor of geological explanations for most features. This is worth stating plainly. The face on Mars is, by current imaging, most likely a mesa. The harder anomaly is atmospheric. In 2015, Dr. John Brandenburg, a plasma physicist formerly of the Kennedy Space Center, published data on isotopic ratios in the Martian atmosphere. Specifically, the abundance of xenon-129 relative to other xenon isotopes. The ratio measured by Mars probes differs sharply from what would be expected from natural planetary formation processes. Brandenburg's interpretation that this signature is consistent with an ancient nuclear event is not accepted by mainstream planetary science, but the data itself is real. The xenon-129 ratio was reported in NASA mission returns. The question of what caused it remains open in the peer-reviewed literature, with proposed explanations ranging from unusual mantle outgassing to supernova enrichment. What is not disputed is that Mars carries an atmospheric fingerprint that other rocky planets in the solar system do not carry. Something happened there. Nobody has explained it in a way the whole field accepts. I want to be honest about where the evidence gets thin. The Book of Enoch does not name Mars. It names 7 stars, and it says one of them is bound in a red pit. The mainstream reading of these passages is that they are apocalyptic vision, not planetary description. Nickelsberg and Vanderkam do not entertain a Mars connection, and they are the leading Enoch scholars alive. The Cydonia face is probably a mesa. Brandenburg's nuclear Mars hypothesis is on the fringe of planetary science and stays there. I could build a stronger version of this story by ignoring these facts. I am choosing not to. What I cannot ignore is the correlation. A text that names 7 wandering stars singles out one as red and imprisoned and was banned in the 4th century, matches point for point the way every ancient culture from Babylon to Rome described Mars. And the planet those cultures were describing, when it was finally photographed close up, turned out to carry atmospheric signatures that planetary science still cannot cleanly explain. This is not proof. It is a coincidence that keeps pulling at the edge of my attention until I have to write it down. The pattern is not the Mars connection specifically. The pattern is the structure of what happened to the text. A document that was cited as scripture by the author of Jude, quoted by 3 centuries of church fathers, and copied at Qumran in 11 separate manuscripts, was quietly excluded from the Western canon at a small regional council. It was then not merely excluded, but functionally deleted. Copies stopped being made. Monastic libraries let it decay. For 1300 years, the West operated as if the text had never existed. When Bruce brought copies back in 1773, the initial reaction was interest. When Lawrence translated it in 1821, the reaction was polite curiosity. When Charles produced the scholarly edition in 1912, the reaction was academic containment. When Qumran forced the text back into view in the 1950s, the reaction was to file it under Second Temple apocalyptic literature and move on. At every stage, the response was calibrated to prevent the text from being read the way it was originally read. Not banned in a way that would draw attention, reclassified, moved from scripture to apocrypha, from apocrypha to visionary literature, from visionary literature to scholarly footnote. Each move plausible on its own, the cumulative effect. A book that names 7 celestial bodies, describes their motion, identifies one as a prison for beings who violated a fundamental law, and was considered authoritative by the earliest Christians, is now something almost no Christian has read. Ethiopia preserved it because Ethiopia was outside the reach of the Council of Laodicea. This is the recurring geography of preserved knowledge. What centralized authority can suppress, isolated communities sometimes keep. Russian bell founders lost their frequencies when the Soviet state melted their bells. Ethiopian monks kept Enoch when Rome deleted it. The pattern of preservation runs through the edges of empires, not the centers. And what the edges preserve is exactly what the center found intolerable. Once you see it, you begin to notice how the same shape repeats. A text describes something specific. A council or committee or ministry declares the text unfit. Copies stop being made. The knowledge is not destroyed, only moved into a category no one is expected to consult. Generations pass. When the text is rediscovered, the categories it was moved into are already in place. Scholars read it through those categories. The original claim, whatever it was, is now unreadable except by people willing to ignore the categories entirely. Enoch describes a red prison at the edge of the sky. The description is precise enough that it survived a millennium of exile in a mountain monastery and returned intact. When the technology finally existed to look at the object the description matched, the object turned out to have exactly the anomalies you would expect if the description were more than metaphor. And still, the description is filed under visionary literature, because the alternative filing would require rewriting several other things at the same time. The pattern is not that the text is wrong. The pattern is that the text is unfileable in the categories we have agreed to use. The 3 Ge'ez manuscripts James Bruce carried out of Ethiopia in 1773 are still in European libraries. The Aramaic fragments from Cave 4 are in the Israel Antiquities Authority collection. The Book of Luminaries, with its precise 364-day calendar, is in every edition of Enoch published in the last century. The Xenon 129 anomaly in the Martian atmosphere is in the NASA data returns. The 1976 Viking photographs of Cydonia are still viewable in the public archive of the National Space Science Data Center. None of this is hidden. None of it requires clearance to access. The information is entirely available to anyone who cares to look. What is not available is the interpretive framework that would allow the pieces to be assembled without immediate professional consequence. To connect Enoch's imprisoned stars to the ancient Mars traditions is to leave the Second Temple Studies department. To connect the ancient Mars traditions to the modern atmospheric anomalies is to leave planetary science. The categories are the fence, and every scholar who has spent a career inside one of those categories has a reason not to climb it. The book that named the 7 stars was quoted as scripture, then banned, then forgotten, then rediscovered exactly when the technology existed to photograph what it described. The Ethiopians kept it. Council of Laodicea buried it. The Viking cameras photographed something no one wants to explain, and the description is still sitting in chapter 18, in the same words the scribes at Qumran copied 22 centuries ago, waiting for someone to read it the way it was written.